Housing issues touch every American, and the upcoming 2020 election will definitely have an impact on how those issues are shaped. When it comes to strategies for affordable, fair, and expanded housing in the US, Donald Trump and Joe Biden have very different approaches. So let's dive into how these candidates differ and how their policies can affect you.
So if Biden is elected, he would expand the Section 8 housing voucher program. This is really important because right now only 1 in 5 eligible households are actually getting Section 8. So that means we have many Americans who are eligible for low-income housing or vouchers, and they're just not receiving it. Biden would make this an entitlement, which means that it would expand this program and people who are eligible would most likely receive vouchers. So another thing Biden would do if he becomes president is reinstate the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. This is a rule under the Fair Housing Act. And what this rule does is it puts a finer point on making sure that municipalities are ending discriminatory practices. So if you're a city, state, county receiving HUD dollars, you have to sort of go through a series of steps to analyze any sort of discriminatory practices in your area before you can get those HUD dollars. That's what the AFFH rule does. You might have heard about this rule recently in the media. Trump got rid of the rule. He sort of threw the whole thing out and then went on Twitter saying that he was going to protect the suburbs from low-income housing. That's not completely accurate because the AFFH rule doesn't prescribe any one solution. It simply asks municipalities to take a look at what's going on in their areas and just to make sure that there aren't any discriminatory practices, and if they are, take steps to get rid of them. What's interesting about this rule is that housing experts across the board, both Republicans and Democrats, are really pro the AFFH rule. They really believe it's important, and it just makes sure that everyone is doing their due diligence to promote equitability in housing. Detractors of the AFFH rule criticize the amount of steps that municipalities have to go through to get HUD dollars. They think that it's too much and that those steps should be rolled back a bit. But others say that while that is true, that maybe there are too many steps, throwing out the entire rule might not be the best solution. So another important thing Biden would do in terms of housing is he would incentivize limiting of single-family zoning in states, cities across the country. Single-family zoning is problematic because we have such a shortage of inventory right now. We're really running low on the supply of housing. And what single family zoning does is it limits where we can build, and it also artificially drives up the prices of land and housing. So Biden will give tax incentives to areas that roll back some of these limited zoning laws. Trump really hasn't made any moves toward incentivizing limiting single-family zoning. Most people really agree that we need to look at single-family zoning and think about how we approach it going forward in order to expand our housing inventory. And finally, another important thing he would do is offer a tax credit for people who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. That includes utilities and rent. This would be a great relief for those folks because wages haven't really kept up with the cost of housing. So one of Trump's moves to help low-income families and low-income areas is to create opportunity zones. Opportunity zones are a tax incentive for businesses to go into distressed communities in order to stimulate the economy and also to create jobs. So under another Trump presidency, we'll likely see this program continue and perhaps even expand. People on both sides of the aisle hail the idea as, a really great positive idea, But the criticism is there's not enough reporting required. So we don't really know what the results are. How many jobs are opportunity zones creating? How much is it stimulating the local economy? Another criticism is that it's giving tax breaks to businesses that would have already invested in those communities. The tax breaks are not going directly to low-income families. They're going to businesses to hopefully trickle down to these families. So those are sort of the pros and cons of opportunity zones. So under another Trump presidency, one of the things we might expect to see is some loosening of fair housing rules. Recently, HUD amended the disparate impact rule. This is important because the disparate impact rule is something that many people use in court cases to fight against unfair housing practices or discriminatory housing practices. By amending that rule, it's going to make it almost impossible for people to use it in court cases. There are advocates for this rule on both sides of the aisle and throughout the housing industry, from mortgage lenders to policy experts. Another interesting way a president can affect the housing market is through taxes and tariffs. And recently we've seen that Trump has imposed tariffs on Canadian lumber, which has raised the cost of building materials. And people on both sides of the aisle, construction companies, developers, are calling for Trump to renegotiate these tariffs with our Canadian lumbers so that we can reduce the cost of building materials and start getting up to speed with the inventory, as we're facing a severe housing shortage right now. So housing is a big topic that affects every individual in our country. And one of the things that we might be able to expect from another Trump presidency is rolling back some of these protections, especially for transgender folks. We can see this in the Equal Access Rule. They just amended this rule to allow single-sex homeless shelters to turn away transgender people. This is really important because our transgender community is very vulnerable to discrimination, and by allowing single-sex shelters to turn them away, they're at an increased risk of homelessness and all of the problems that are associated with that. These are shelters that are receiving government dollars. So it's an important rule and something that we might see continued going forward under a second Trump administration. If Biden is elected, we can expect a robust housing plan. He earmarked $640 billion over 10 years, which is a huge sum of money. Some of his detractors wonder how we're going to pay for this housing plan, while others say this is an investment back into the country. If we see Trump elected again, one of the things that we can expect is rolling back of some of these fair housing rules. So he's really going to loosen some of these strict rules around fair and anti-discriminatory housing. Another thing that we might expect to see from Trump is the continuation of opportunity zones, which are tax breaks for businesses who invest in distressed communities.